Good afternoon, and welcome to the first session of the first installment of the Met Opera's HD Live in Schools book club for the 2023-24 year. My name is Nick Rinehart, and I'm the content manager for education at the Met Opera. And we are so excited to welcome Ryan McKinny and to be joined by students and educators from HD Live in Schools partner districts across the country. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we turn to Dead Man Walking, which is the topic of the hour, I want to emphasize again how lucky we are to have Ryan with us today. He has been recognized by Opera News as one of the finest singers of his generation. And he is currently starring as Joseph De Rocher in Jake Heggie and Terrence McNally's Dead Man Walking, for which he made his role debut at the Lyric Opera of Chicago in a performance that was hailed as indelible and an acting tour de force. His turn as Joseph De Rocher at the Met has been lauded by critics as a richly human performance, his warmly robust bass-baritone voice making De Rocher's humanity evident from the start. An advocate as well as a performer, Ryan continues to work with groups like Search for Common Ground, the world's largest peace-building organization, and Equal Justice USA, a national organization that works to transform the criminal justice system. So hopefully we'll get to talk about all of that and maybe a little more in the next few minutes. So as we just noticed, this is not your first time performing Joseph De Rocher. You did the character in Chicago several years ago. What did you learn doing the character the first time around that you brought to this new Met production? And or has your approach changed given that this is the second time around? A new production, it's at the Met, which kind of changes things. It's going to be in movie theaters, which kind of changes things. And how did this production force you to reassess your approach to the character, if at all?
Yeah, so anytime I do a role more than once, I always try to let it evolve. Even just within the run of a given production, I tend to make little adjustments and feel differently about certain choices. This show in particular, you know, it's one thing to have experienced it as an audience member. You know, I saw this for the first time when I was at Juilliard back when I think it was like, I don't know, 2002 or 3 or something like that. But being in it, particularly in Chicago, this was Lenny Folia's production, which is very realistic. And in a way, I'm happy I did that one first, because you kind of have all of the parts of death row. There's a divider between Sister Helen and I. I'm shackled the whole time. The opening scene happened on stage where I acted out raping and murdering a young woman, which was very intense. And so a lot of that experience was about kind of just leaning into the intensity of the whole thing, the emotional arc of it. And in a way, because it wasn't filmed and film wasn't an integral part of it, I think maybe my performance was slightly broader for, you know, a big theater. Still very emotionally based, but maybe physically a little bit bigger. And now coming back to it, in part of it is that and we'll probably talk about this, but my sort of personal connection to this has changed over that time. But in terms of the production, you know, there's cameras are already involved in this production, even without the HD broadcast, and are on stage with me a lot of the time and very close. So I always think that when you have a clear thought as an actor, that comes across even to a big house. And that's even more true when you're dealing with cameras that are close. So for me, it's about being very thoughtful about my choices, being really specific and letting the thought make drive the scene and not translating that to some big gestures or something. Particularly with this Ivo van Hove's production is really about kind of emotional truth and not so much about like big physicality. And I think it works really, really well.
Yeah, that's interesting because it usually when people think about the Met, they think about scale. Like things are bigger, the stage is bigger, the auditorium is bigger, but you're suggesting that because of the film elements, you actually have to scale things down a bit because there's more sort of like close-up attention on your face that doesn't require the same sort of large gesture that you might have had to do in Chicago. So
I think that it's also, yes, and I wouldn't say necessarily scaled back so much as just really specific, right? So it can't be, sometimes we opera singers will do, oh, I haven't moved in a while. I have to move an arm, or I need to do this to like sing well. And you could still do those things, but especially when you have a camera on you, it's very obvious if someone checks out at all. And anybody who's watched an HD broadcast of any kind will note that every once in a while a singer might have a singer thought, and you can kind of see in their eyes, they go somewhere else for a second, and that becomes really important to stay connected in a production like this. And I also will say that I think in general, that you can be very small in a huge space as long as your thinking is really clear. Just a shift of your focus with the right intention can come across clear as day to a 5,000 seat house. What doesn't work very well is muddy, like being kind of generic in your choices. So that's where I've really tried to dial in some of those choices in this production.
Interesting. So this was something I was going to ask you later, but since you've already mentioned the film aspect of the opera production, students are going to see, and I'm curious to see how this will come across in a movie theater, because I got the chance to see it on opening night, and there are camera crews on stage filming the actors close up. There are projected videos that are seen sort of behind and on top above what's happening on stage. And sort of live video feeds that are happening during the opera. And I know you are also a filmmaker, and you've done some documentary stuff as well as creating some original material. And so I'm wondering, given all of this extra stuff of doing this at the Met, not having opera singer thoughts, staying focused and in the moment, how does your experience as a filmmaker, either behind the camera or just working on the film production process in general, inform your approach to this different kind of production?
Yeah. So during COVID, during the lockdown, I spent a lot of time making films from behind the camera, editing, also on camera stuff. And I think the biggest thing I learned is that editing choices tell much more story than you think they do. And really shift the entire storyline with smart editing choices. And in fact, this production kind of does that already. There's certain things that if you're in the house, you'll see, you kind of are forced to watch a certain thing. Whereas in a in a more traditional setting, you can look at whatever you want on the stage, right? And obviously, like, directors and actors have a way of kind of pulling your focus to specific things. But in this case, Evo and the film team are really focusing you on what part of the story they want you to see at any given moment. But it also, just my own experience of watching a lot of footage of singers on camera and directing them, and myself, this exactly what I'm talking about, that where the thought tells the whole story, it becomes even more important. And so I definitely am aware of that, especially in the process. I have often, I don't do it when I'm in the performance itself, but in the kind of getting ready for it in rehearsal process, often was using my brain as a filmmaker to think like, okay, how is this going to work with the way this is framed, where the camera is relative to me? If I move quickly, I'm going to fall out of frame. So I need to make sure that the camera operator anticipates my movement. There's a lot of things like that where if you don't do it quite right, you can take people out of the story. That it was very helpful for me to have a film background to kind of think of all that.
Yeah, because I just wonder, so much of the rehearsal takes place in rehearsal halls before you actually get to the stage.
Yeah.
So at that point, for all those weeks rehearsing not on the main stage, how do you even know what the film crew is? I assume they're in the room with you, but you don't actually see the projected film.
Well,
so or do you?
They did have it up on like a television screen in the rehearsal room.
That you could see.
I couldn't. Well, while I'm playing the scene, I can't see it anyway, right? Because I have a specific focus that can't be that screen.
Right.
But like what I would do is talk with the camera operator between times we would rehearse and talk about what they were trying to achieve, what angle they're looking for, how I can work within that, and all of that. So we did have time to kind of talk it out. I've never seen the final product, but I think, you know, I've seen clips of it now. And I think it works really well, but just being able to interact with them and also with the directorial team to kind of make sure we were all on the same page about what we wanted to get across was really great to have them in rehearsal. And then it makes it easier to shift into HD broadcast because you're kind of already dealing with cameras all the time. So it's not all that different for us.
Right. But it is, just to clarify for the students who are watching, there will be a second camera crew that is the Met Opera Live in HD camera crew, capturing the camera crew that is on stage, that is part of the production. So it's like a Russian doll of
I do think
videographers.
My understanding is some of the time they will use the actual feed from the on stage cameras. So we'll see how that. I'm very interested. You know, maybe in a replay I'll get to watch it, but I'll be interested to hear from you all that are watching it how you like it and how it played out.
So, talking about the opera, you have done Jake Heggie before. You've done Dead Man Walking before, and I guess saw it when you were in school. You're also later this season, and correct me if I'm wrong, doing a world premiere of a new Jake Heggie one-act opera with the libretto by Gene Shear called Before It All Goes Dark, which for those interested also has a human rights aspect to it. The opera was commissioned by a group called Music of Remembrance, which is an organization that uses music to sort of advocate for remembrance of the Holocaust. And this is premiering in the spring, I think in Seattle, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
What can you tell us about Jake Heggie as a writer of music, as a composer? What is it like to perform a Heggie role? Is there anything that you can take from Dead Man and bring to Before It All Goes Dark? And what's it like to sing a Jake Heggie role as opposed to a classic canonical opera? Are they similar in more ways than we might expect? Are they distinct in other ways?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, Jake's music is always really singable. He really has the feeling for the voice and the way it wants to rise and fall and the dramatic moments, like where they lie in the voice, and in a way that many modern composers can really struggle with. And the other thing is that his music is, people use the word accessible, and I kind of hate that term because it implies a simplicity that actually is incorrect. That there is a real depth to this music, but you can experience it for the first time and really get the emotional storytelling going on without having to understand it or do homework, which I love about it. And it's very, in a time where it's kind of like not popular to be sincere in the world right now, right?
Yep. Irony is the thing.
Yeah, exactly. We're all supposed to be sarcastic all the time, and you know, genuine emotions are kind of like that's so cringe or whatever. But he manages to have this genuine sincerity and authenticity through the music that makes it very easy to deal with as a singer. If you just do what's written and you do, you know, in this show, what Terrence McNally wrote in terms of the text, it's already there. You don't have to really, there are some other modern composers, many of whom I love, who I've sung a lot of their music, where you kind of have to take it and then do another step to get it like ready to give to an audience, because there's a kind of another layer of obscurity to it maybe. But I actually think that Jake's music is more, to me, like Verdi or something than like modern, because it's this, there's a little bit of a Verismo quality to it, hard on your sleeve type of stuff, and also the way the vocal lines can go tend to be dramatic but also lyric at the same time, meaning they're kind of like always beautiful but also can be really big. And I think that Verdi's the sort of more standard composer I often think of him next to. just in the way it kind of sits for the voice and the way he approaches it, which I've told him before, and he approves of that.
I'm sure if there's anybody to be compared to as an opera composer, I'm sure he's happy with Verdi. And just for those watching, I would describe, and again, Ryan, interrupt me if I'm wrong, verismo as like an interest in characters that are sort of not down to earth, but often of a lower class, regular people, not kings and nobles and mythical heroes. And so it makes sense that you would use that term to describe Dead Man, which is, an inmate on death row and a nun who's living in a housing project. These are not, mythical, heroic, aristocratic characters. These are regular people that you might encounter in your life.
Yeah, and from a musical perspective too, I think a lot of, Verdi's is like on the edge of verismo, but like Puccini too, you have these huge emotional outbursts musically, right? That are very, they can be complex emotionally, but they tend not to be small. Like they usually are, even if it's quiet, it's like intense all the time. And that's kind of how I see how Jake writes also, as opposed to, some like German expressionism or something like Wozzeck, where there can be big moments, but a lot of time you're dealing with a lot of obscurity, like layers of thinking, and you don't almost know what the character's really going through. And you kind of have to like deal with it more on an intellectual level first.
Mm-hmm. And that goes to the sincerity you're talking about. Like when there's an emotion, it is expressed without this sort of sideways or layered approach. Yeah. Awesome. So before we move into some student questions, I want to ask you briefly just to describe some of the advocacy work you've been doing, both before Dead Man and through this run, with either of the organizations that you've worked with, Search for Common Ground and Equal Justice USA. And you can just tell us a little bit about what they do and how you've worked with them. And I'm going to use that as a transition into some student questions. This one comes from Abigail in Bangor. Shout out to our students in Bangor. What made you decide to get into criminal justice and criminal justice reform? Where did this journey start?
Sure. Yeah, I'm a person who I learned about myself a long time ago now, that for me to feel kind of balanced and happy in my life, I have to be doing some things that feel like they're for other people or for like making the world slightly better. Which is a very tricky thing to do when the world is the way it is at the moment. And I used to do a lot of kind of simpler things like, food bank type work and feeding unhoused people and things like that, which was great. And I still do that sometimes. But as I kind of like grew, it had a little bit of a platform as a singer. I thought maybe I could harness that to make a little bit bigger impact. And actually, my aunt introduced me to Search for Common Ground many years ago, and their kind of whole way of dealing with conflict. So they're about just kind of dealing with everybody as full human beings. It's the simplest way I can put it. Whether that's like warlords in South Sudan or different kinds of government agencies, and for example, like they deal with some of the things going on in Israel and Palestine right now. And to me, that kind of way of thinking really appealed to me. So I really leaned into working with them. And then when I started working on Dead Man Walking for the first time, I started writing some inmates on death row. Just at first it was a little bit kind of research, but it was also because I had asked actually Sister Helen through a mutual friend what I could do, and she said just talk to some people because they really need somebody to talk to. I ended up becoming quite good friends with one man named Terrence, and I visited him a few times, and he and I became pretty close. And actually, I had told him I was going to do Dead Man Walking, and I sort of was like, is it okay to talk about our relationship, because I don't want you to feel like I'm using you as like a publicity thing. And
right.
He said, I want you to talk about me. Just please also talk about me as a human being and not just my case. That was his big thing. He was an amazing poet, an artist, a really caring guy. He took his own life earlier this year. And so coming back to Dead Man Walking this time after his passing was pretty intense for me. And I wanted to take the feelings I had about that and the feelings people have about this show and try to put them into an organization that was directly dealing with criminal justice reform in the United States and specifically around the death penalty. And that's how I found Equal Justice USA. And they've been really wonderful to work with, and they do really incredible work. Because I really think that when you do a piece like this, you know, all of you who will see it tomorrow, or maybe who have already seen it, it can really kind of open you up. You feel sort of like different afterwards. It's an interesting experience. And that can happen a lot in opera. I think that my hope is that people have that opening up experience and then think like, what can I do with that? Is there, you know, actually somebody, some organization, some people that are doing things to make this different in various ways? And so my goal with this is basically just to tell people that these organizations exist and try to help them as much as I can to continue what they're doing, because I think it's really amazing work.
Yeah, so we have another question from Elizabeth, also in Bangor, that sort of goes right to what you were just talking about, which is, given that you have this experience working with Search for Common Ground and Equal Justice, which sort of started as preparation for the role, how does that make it easier or harder to do the role itself?
Yeah.
You know, when you are going into it and it's not just an intellectual or musical exercise, but actually something that deeply impacts you and draws from your own life experience. Does that, obviously it complicates things, but do you sometimes need to turn things on and off to go on stage and get the job done, or do you bring it all with you?
I bring it all with me. I have to say that it's both easier and harder in different ways. It's easier in the sense of I can pull up the anger and frustration and guilt and shame pretty easily based on my interactions with all of these people and kind of knowing the stories that live behind this. Where it gets harder is it's exhausting emotionally on a given night, but also the totality of doing this. And it was the same when I did it in 2019, but it's even more intense now. It's the Met, you know, opening the season, a lot of press, all of that stuff. So the overall, you know, I'm going to be ready to put this to bed after tomorrow, because it really takes a lot out of me. But I feel a real responsibility to tell the story as fully and honestly as I can. One thing I do, if you've seen my social media, I've mentioned this, but the Met makeup staff asked if, you know, they put fake tattoos on me, and they asked if I wanted anything in particular. And I asked for a black rose on my hand, because my friend Terrence wrote this poem called The Black Rose that is kind of when I remember him, that's like the thing that jumps out the most. So in fact, sometimes on stage, if I'm having a night where I'm a little tired or I'm like not quite in the moment, I actually look down at it on stage and remember, like, this isn't just about you doing a good job because you're an opera singer and you're paid to do this, but like you have a story to tell, and these people are seeing this for maybe the first time, and maybe they're the one person that's the feather that on the camel's back that turns the tide in one specific situation. So you really have to like go for it all the way. So it is both easier and harder.
And is the black rose tattoo? Is that on your hand?
Yeah, on my right hand.
On your right hand. So maybe there'll be a close up at some point during the screening tomorrow.
More than one,
yeah. So that actually dovetails really brilliantly with the question we received from Taya in Honolulu. What is it like to go through the emotional turmoil of being executed night after night? How do you recover from the trauma that must do to you? And, you know, for students who haven't seen the production yet, this is, in terms of the structure of the opera, sort of a foregone conclusion. You sort of know what's going to happen at the end of the opera, at the beginning of the opera. And so it's this very tense, for the audience, this very tense sort of waiting game of how is this going to be dealt with? How is this going to be shown? How are the people in the room going to react? So how do you deal with that buildup and then do it a couple, you know, it's not night after night, right? Because it's every couple of nights, but how do you recover and prepare yourself to get back into it?
So there's a couple of interesting factors at play. I would say that the most emotionally kind of wrenching part is the lead up to the confession and then the confession itself.
Okay.
Death is more traumatic for the audience than it is for me. Where the kind of trauma comes from is the holding back of the characters. He doesn't want to let this out, right? He doesn't want to admit his guilt. He doesn't want to connect to this person. And so there's this kind of like feeling of being stuck, right? And that kind of manifests in my body. In fact, when we were rehearsing it, I found it really challenging. Doing the show, you'll see tomorrow, assuming all goes well, I kind of have this huge release of emotions in the confession scene. I cry. People ask me, how do you sing when you cry? The trick is don't hold it back. The holding back of it is the part that makes singing difficult. You just let it happen and be as big as it needs to be, then it's fine. But so I get this kind of cathartic release in that scene, actually, just like the character does. So I find that as long as I see that through, as long as I have that kind of release, then I feel okay afterwards. I feel like I can let it go through the process of doing it on stage. And so by death, I actually feel kind of like the whole thing's out of me by then. Which actually was much more difficult during rehearsals when I couldn't really do the whole last scene. And I felt stuck for days at a time sometimes. Yeah,
you couldn't get to the catharsis stage that happens when you cry and you have, it sort of resets things. I can imagine during the rehearsal process not being able to go all the way, and you just
very
feel
difficult
like,
show to rehearse because you can't really like mark it. It doesn't work that way.
So this is our final student question. This is from Cole in Fort Worth, Texas. What do you wish for audiences to take away from this production? Whether that's in terms of advocacy work or in terms of their experience of the opera, of Jake Heggie's music, of the production?
I would say that it's kind of none of my business what you take away from it. And that's real. Like, I think our job is to tell this story as authentically as we can, and you take away what you want. Some people come away from this piece feeling like this man should be executed, that they identify with these parents so much that go through this horrible thing that they're like, yeah, I actually think the death penalty makes sense. And many people come away with the opposite feeling. I think my only hope for people is that they open themselves up to whatever they're feeling and just sit with it for a little while. And if that compels you then to go do some things that maybe change the way this world is, that's great. Try not to brush it under the rug. That's my hope for people, whatever those feelings are.
Yeah, it reminds me of something Sister Helen said when she was working on the movie of Dead Man Walking with Tim Robbins, where he told her, like, there's a distinction between art and propaganda, and the point of art is not to tell the audience what to think, but to present them with a set of questions or problems and let them come away with their own understanding. And it seems like that sort of ambiguity is sort of built into the opera, that there is no single answer it wants you to come away with, but it instead wants to show you something that you have to think about afterwards. And what you think about it is going to be your own sort of individual response.
Yeah, I don't think we want to be prescriptive about, like, this is an anti-death penalty opera. It's really not written that way. It's about human beings and how they interact with each other. And there's a whole bunch of different ways you might react to it. So no reaction is the wrong one.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ryan. On behalf of our HC Live and School students and educators across the country, we can't wait to see Dead Man Walking tomorrow. Although some might see the encores on Wednesday. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.